Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K through 12 school shooting database. And today I'm joined by two guests from the very start of this show. From episode number 1, Dr. James Densley from Metro State University, and from episode number 5, Dr. Jillian Peterson. And they are here to discuss their new publication in one of the most prestigious academic journals in the entire world, Nature. James and Jill, welcome to the show today.
Thanks for having us. We're delighted to be here.
Yeah, thanks, David.
So there's a long road to getting something published. Your new paper, The Mental Health Consequences of Exposure to Mass and Non-Mass Shootings in a National Sample of U.S. Adults. Nature is transparent enough that they actually show the date that you first submitted, the date that it's approved, the date that it's finally published. That process was more than a year, but a lot of work actually went into this paper. So I want to talk today about what does it take to do a national survey? What are the questions that can come out of a large national survey? And then how does that get translated into a paper that has enough impact to end up in a place like Nature?
These are great questions. I can begin a little bit on the kind of methodology behind this national survey. So we actually partnered with YouGov, which many people will know for doing these like large nationally representative surveys across the country. And in fact, internationally as well. They have a presence globally. So we worked with YouGov to field a carefully matched representative survey of 10,000 US adults. And we fielded that survey in January of 2024. Now, getting to that point took some time because we had to first craft the questions to go into the survey. We had to think about exactly what things we wanted to capture with the survey. And then, of course, with any survey, you're always thinking about how much attention do people want to pay to this issue. So the survey ended up being about 12 minutes long. And that's, I think, in some ways, probably about as long as you'd ever want to go with a survey of this nature. But what happens with YouGov is they have this multi-stage sampling, and it starts with a synthetic frame, which is based on the census, the US Census. So respondents get weighed on age, education, gender, race and ethnicity, and their voting behavior from the 2020 vote was what we did, because this was back in 2024 before the national election. And then what this means is that this sample, the final sample, will mirror the country as a whole. So in the survey, we asked about 6 distinct types of gun violence exposure. So this was everything from a mass shooting in one's community to actually being shot and injured. And then we followed up with a series of standardized questions about 4 different mental health outcomes. We asked about anxiety, depression, panic attacks, and PTSD. And plus, how long those symptoms have lasted. And then the final step with this is we ran kind of weighted descriptive statistics and what is known as a multivariable logistic regression, which is a statistical technique to see which of those demographic factors actually predicted any impact and whether that impact lingered beyond a year. So that's the sort of very technical description of what we did. And also to mention that survey includes lots of other questions, lots of other variables that are not even part of this paper, with an overall goal of really trying to better understand the American public's experience with and exposure to gun violence.
So you've got 10,000 people in a survey for about 12 minutes. You want to get as much information as possible out of that survey. And you're really looking at, what are the consequences, specifically the mental health consequences. How did you decide that PTSD and anxiety and panic attacks were going to be the types of things that you asked them about to quantify this?
And the one thing I will mention methodology is that the reason that these aren't done very often at this scale is because they are extraordinarily expensive to do. It takes just a ton of resources to be able to gather a representative sample of that size. And so we had 12 minutes of people's time. We wanted to know exposure. We were really interested in impact of different types of exposure. We talk a lot in this country about the increase in anxiety and in depression and trauma. But we don't really talk about that in terms of exposure to gun violence if it's not direct exposure, right? Of course, we know that victims of mass shootings have experienced these things, but what if I'm just, it's happening outside my apartment? Or what if I'm locking down in a classroom? I never saw gunfire, but I had that experience of locking down. Kind of what is that doing to the general public in the US, and how often is that happening? That was something we realized we really didn't know. And then, of course, we also got into a lot of different things that will come out in different papers around gun ownership and reasons for gun ownership and safe storage and all sorts of stuff.
And so you get this survey out, you get 10,000 responses. It's something that you commissioned. How do you know that the results that come back from that survey are something that's valid before you start writing them up?
Oh, that's another great question, because there's a healthy skepticism with anything like this. As Jill had just mentioned, whenever you listen to a podcast or on the radio or in the news, and they'll talk about, we surveyed Americans about their voting preferences, or, what toothpaste they like, or whatever the sample might be at a given time. Usually those surveys, whether it's Pew Research or Gallup polls, are using about 1,000 people in that sample. And that gives you a margin of error of sort of plus or minus 3%. In our case, we did 10,000 people. So that's a survey that's 10,000, it's 10 times larger than the 1,000 that you would usually get in this way. So as Jill mentioned, it's expensive to begin with. But then you're also thinking, by making it larger, you're trying to capture things that you can't capture with those smaller numbers. This is where this was a strategic move, because going into it, we anticipated that exposure to gun violence was going to be a rare event. We thought that we would need large numbers to be able to detect any effect, because this is not the sort of thing that we felt like the average American would be exposed to. That was our assumption going into it. So when we got the results back, there was this double take moment where we wondered whether or not this was some sort of statistical aberration, because the sheer reach of gun violence was staggering. We found that 1 in 5 Americans had said that a mass shooting had happened in their community. 18% of our respondents said that they had been threatened with a gun in their lifetime. And about 2% of our respondents said they'd actually been shot, either in a mass shooting event or in just an everyday gun violence incident. So we went into it thinking we need a large sample size to be able to detect an effect. When we got the data back, we actually realized, yes, that large sample size certainly helped, but there was still a really noticeable effect here. And so we then did some validity checks, matching the survey against other kind of population surveys and other samples, such as the American Community Survey and other things, to see whether or not other measures kind of lined up. And that's a way of sort of fact checking the results. So when you look then at those demographic characteristics of the survey, the age, the gender, race and ethnicity, political preferences, and so on, do they line up with these other samples? And in our case, it did. We then also included questions that could be measured against these other surveys. Things like fear of violence and crime in a community, or exposure to gang membership and other things like this. These are measures that have been included in other community-based surveys for several years, and there's good data on them. So then we wanted to see, do our numbers line up with those? And what we found is that, yes, they're all within that margin of error, which gave us pretty good confidence in the results that we found.
And I'll just add one other thing we did was we were worried that maybe if you saw a survey on gun violence exposure, you would be more likely to take that survey if you had had that experience. So what if we were sort of overestimating because of the people who were drawn to that survey? So the company we worked with, YouGov, does an omnibus survey where they send out surveys about all sorts of things. So we asked basically to put one question at the bottom of a survey about something not related to gun violence, about mass violence exposure, just to see if it was attached to a different survey. Do we still see numbers that high? And we again got consistent numbers, which that also gave us confidence that we weren't just oversampling people who had been exposed.
I think on its face, that idea that 20% of Americans, so 1 out of every 5 people, have a mass shooting in their community seems just unbelievable. But then when you start thinking about the impact of some of these incidents and how many people are exposed to them, all of a sudden that actually seems even low. I mean, just in the past 2 weeks, there was a shooting in the middle of Florida State University's campus. That's a school that has 60, 70,000 students, another 20,000 or so staff and visitors on campus. That's 100,000 people or so just from that event would say we had a mass shooting. I think about my neighborhood here in Orlando, where there's been the Pulse nightclub shooting. There was a mass shooting during the 4th of July celebration that about 100,000 people go to. There was a mass shooting downtown on Halloween, the night before we all presented at the Gun Violence Summit that you hosted by the Violence Project at Hamline University. So that's just within my community, which is a pretty safe community. There have been 3 mass shootings. So I'm actually kind of shocked. I think the biggest pushback that you'd get from somebody who's kind of a casual reader of this story would be, 20%, how's that even possible? It almost seems like that's even too low.
I would say it gets a little bit to how you define these events. And this is something we've wrestled with, I think, from the beginning of our research into mass shootings, particularly. For a long time, I did a lot of research on gun violence and everyday gang violence. And in that space, there wasn't these sort of arbitrary cutoffs where you would say that you have to have had 4 or more people killed, or it had to be in a public space and so forth. So usually when we're defining these types of events, we put a lot of strict parameters around them. That's intentional. Definitions matter in social science. So when you're trying to understand an indiscriminate shooting in a public space, having some thresholds for the number of people killed or the type of shooting it is makes a lot of sense. And so for years, the work that Jill and I are probably most known for is our work with the Violence Project, looking at mass shootings where 4 or more people were killed in a public space in an event that wasn't related to gang violence or domestic violence or everyday crime, a drug deal gone bad, things like that. Because we were really trying to understand the life histories of the perpetrators of these really high-profile, indiscriminate acts. This survey, however, is a departure from that earlier work. And what we've tried to do in this survey, and again, it goes back to the idea of we were trying to generate a large enough sample because we didn't think we'd be able to detect any effect going into it, that we wanted a broader definition to try and capture a wider spectrum of gun violence exposure. So in this particular survey, we define a mass shooting, for instance, as 4 or more people shot in a public space. But that could include gang-related violence. It could include everyday crime in a community. Once you have that broader definition, as you mentioned in your question, it opens up the possibility for much wider exposure. And then also, in addition to looking at mass shootings, we are looking at all forms of gun violence in this survey. So we ask specific questions about their exposure to mass shootings, but we also ask specific questions about exposure to any form of gun violence. And that's when you start to realize the ripple effects of this are really on a level that perhaps we we never anticipated. We've got data now that can really prove that when these shootings occur, they're having ripple effects within our communities that we cannot discount any longer.
Well, from the victim's perspective, the intent really doesn't matter. I think the Violence Project was about understanding why perpetrators commit intentional mass violence and then the pathways to prevent them from going down that road or to detect somebody who's in crisis before they get to that point. But if you're a person who's shot, and I think about this with schools, that's how I shaped my data collection for schools. If the security guard is playing with his gun and it goes off and it shoots a student, or if there's a fight in the hallway and a student gets shot, or if there are shots fired and somebody gets trampled and has their legs broken or serious injuries, for you as the victim, does it really matter what the intent was? Because you are dealing with the consequences of a gunshot or a traumatic injury or the traumatic experience of thinking that you're about to be shot. And I think that's what's really interesting about this kind of victim-oriented study, because we spend so much time talking about perpetrators, but you're actually capturing there are far more people injured and impacted and traumatized by these shootings than anybody understood. And what's the consequence when there are people who, for up to a year after these shootings, are having anxiety and panic attacks and depression and other mental health circumstances?
Yeah, and that's, I think we've always said, there is no right or wrong definition of a mass shooting. It's what is the definition that matches the research question that you are asking, right? And then there are right and wrong definitions based on your specific research question. So when we were interested in understanding the life histories of people who enter spaces and fire indiscriminately, it made sense to have a really narrow group with a lot of media coverage where we could really dig deep into their childhoods and all the information that we needed to understand that group and prevention. In this case, we were interested in what is the general public's experience with all forms of this gun violence, right? And as you said, if you're shot, you really, your consequences and your mental health consequences and physical consequences and all the things that happen, it doesn't matter sort of exactly what the motivation is of the person who did it. And so we were trying to be really broad and inclusive in this way. And it made us even think about even the definition of 4 or more shot. A lot of these incidents were maybe sort of gun violence that exploded on a street, a conflict that erupted, or a gang-related drive-by shooting where lots of bullets are flying. You get struck in the leg, are you necessarily reporting that to the police or going to the hospital? Or if you get struck by shrapnel, it's actually really hard to think about how we have a true measure of how often this is happening, especially cases that aren't getting a lot of media coverage. But essentially what we found when we looked at this is the mental health impacts are profound. The numbers of people getting exposed were way beyond what we expected. And then the people who report, yes, I experienced mental health impacts, whether that was anxiety, depression, panic, PTSD, it ranged. If you were injured in a mass shooting, it's nearly everybody, 95%. But even people with just community exposure, 60%, right? Like you weren't even there. But 62% of people report having mental health impacts. Same things for being threatened with a firearm. And actually, that's where we saw the long-term exposure over a year of symptoms, right? So this means it wasn't just a traumatic event happened, you experienced some terrible mental health consequences, but you worked through them and they went away and you're able to go along with your everyday functioning. These are people who have long-term impacts. And that was 43% of people who had been threatened with a firearm, who had been shot at in a community violence setting. There are just so many people walking around with this type of exposure and this type of mental health consequence. I don't think I realized what a profound impact it was having on us.
I was just thinking, this is like the kicker here. 6 in 10 people in this survey who merely lived near a mass shooting scene reported mental health impacts. anxiety, depression, PTSD, without even being physically harmed in the event. And again, as we mentioned, it's the mass shootings that would grab the headlines, and they obviously cause really intense, immediate distress. But the data is showing that the long-term psychological toll is actually heavier for everyday non-mass shootings that are occurring in communities. And so I think our study moves the conversation from if gun violence harms our mental health to how often, how long, and for whom. And that hopefully gives policymakers some concrete targets for support. No matter what it is, every shooting, big or small, it's writing an invoice for mental health that's currently being unpaid. And what we really need is to dig deep into that. We need to do something about it because we are all paying a price for this.
And I would just add to the most common mental health impact by far is anxiety. And young people are exposed at nearly twice the rate, or maybe it's more than twice the rate. I can't remember the exact numbers. Their exposure level is significantly higher. And so, like, I just finished reading The Anxious Generation, which is on the New York Times bestseller list. That's like young people's mental health anxiety is all about their cell phone usage. And it's like, well, actually, like, they are walking around being exposed to gun violence on a daily basis and reporting that that's causing them extremely high levels of long-term anxiety. And we're just not talking about it or capturing it.
I mean, I see that in my own community in Orlando, where I live a little more than a mile from the Pulse nightclub. My jiu-jitsu gym is directly across the street from the Pulse nightclub. There is, in front of the building, temporary walls that were put up years ago that have pictures of every victim. And there are candles and different people that are there and relatives of victims who have come to visit at different points. And just about every bar and restaurant in Orlando has some sort of picture or memorial because a person that worked there, a person that was a friend of the staff, was killed in that shooting. It is something that every single person in this community is exposed to just about every day. Jill, as a psychologist, what is the impact when somebody's reporting anxiety on a student who's in school or a person who's working a job or a mother who's trying to take care of her kids as she's feeling anxiety?
Yeah, I mean, untreated anxiety can have a significant impact on your daily functioning, whether it's your ability to parent, your ability to hold a job, your ability to socialize, to be in public spaces. It kind of manifests itself differently for everyone. It can be very physical. It can cause insomnia, right? It can cause actual like heart palpitations, sweating. It can cause all sorts of things that you avoid different situations. I mean, there's communities where the gun violence exposure is so frequent that you have entire elementary schools where the kids have, the vast majority have been exposed to gun violence. That is going to have a huge ability on their impact to like sit in a classroom and be in math class, right? When you are operating in this really kind of anxious mindset. And so I don't think we have a really good grasp of that yet, exactly how that is playing out, especially for young people.
And that's something where we are not well positioned as a society to help people with this. I mean, if it's 60% of people have anxiety related to gun violence, almost no health insurance covers any sort of mental health support. And even after some of the worst mass shootings in history, there's almost no health support. I think back to Robb Elementary in Uvalde, that the kids in that community, there were no mental health resources. And the students that were in the classrooms with the victims, their parents had to take them to San Antonio and pay out of pocket to have specialty care for children who've had severe trauma. We don't have any sort of publicly accessible system or the appropriate or robust resources to even treat this. Are there some resources or tips or advice that you could offer to, I guess, a fifth of the people listening to this podcast have experienced a shooting? And then some percentage of them are having anxiety and mental health impacts from it that are probably unresolved.
I would say there's a couple of things with this. So your first question to Jill a minute ago, we actually had a student that was working with us at the Violence Project, just a regular, student at college, just so happened to be a criminal justice major and was working with us on some of the projects that we were working on. And out of the blue one day, they disclosed that they had been on the scene of a mass shooting. They'd actually had to lock themselves in a bathroom when the shooting started to unfold in a bar restaurant scenario that they were at. And they just sort of shared this with us. And then they shared immediately afterwards that it was having a detrimental impact on their mental health. And I think this is a great example of exactly what it is we're talking about here. This is just a student that's presenting in our classes on a day-to-day basis as college professors. And they have lived this, and they are looking then to us to help with those challenges. And although colleges and universities have an infrastructure around mental health, it's not a perfect solution to these problems. And I think if you look at the data from our survey, the numbers here are rivaling and in some cases maybe even exceeding the distress that was seen after a major event like 9/11 or after COVID-19. Yet most communities still lack a mental health infrastructure to respond quickly. So this is a problem that is systemic within American society, that we have not adequately funded mental health care going back to the 1960s when we went through a movement of deinstitutionalizing and trying to build up community mental health supports. This is 50, 60 plus years of failed policy. But what is different today is that we didn't have the levels of gun violence exposure back in the 60s and 70s and 80s that we have today. We didn't have the levels of social media exposure back in those days. Our young people today are dealing with greater problems that could be creating mental health challenges. And we have an even worse mental health system to actually deal with them. That's really the problem here. And sometimes I like to say, regardless of your political affiliation, there's always these polarizing aspects of like, is it guns? Is it mental illness? Where's the problem lie? Jill and I's work has consistently said it's all of the above. We have to embrace the complexity here and have adult conversations about adult problems. But if we even take the premise of, okay, it's mental health that's the challenge here, well, let's put our money where our mouths are and fund a mental health infrastructure in this country that could start to address these challenges. Because it's very clear to us that gun violence is having a detrimental impact on our mental health across society.
Yeah, and I would, anxiety is incredibly treatable, right? We do know how to treat anxiety, one of the most treatable mental illnesses, whether it's therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, medication, psychodynamic therapy, whatever your thing is, it's quite treatable. The problem, I think, and I was just thinking about this, like anxiety assumes that your brain is essentially over exaggerating a threat, right? Like you are responding to a threat in a way that is not necessarily rational based on what's happening because of your previous experiences, right? And that's like post-traumatic stress. I think the issue for some young people is like, is it an over-exaggerated threat? Or is the threat, like you can't treat anxiety until the threat is gone, right? And so if you are living in a community where you are exposed to gun violence on a very regular basis, that heightened level is almost like a very much instinctual natural response to be anxious and have heightened stress cortisol, right? Like we see that in domestic violence victims. When you go to war, right, you are living in this very anxious state because you kind of need to be for survival. And I think there are some young people where that is how they are operating, right? And so it's really hard to treat in those circumstances. It's not impossible, which is why I think we see the long-term mental health implications more so in the kind of community violence rather than those kind of one big mass shooting, but then you can kind of get treatment and, you know, you may still feel threatened in public spaces, but you can kind of work through that. And so I do think there's complexity here in how you think about treatment. And then, of course, it's just really differences in access, right? Depending on what community you're in and health insurance you have access to. That is not equally distributed in this country.
It just back to kind of the scope of this, just, I mean, thinking of examples from different social groups that I have, because I think everybody listening should kind of do a thought experiment and think about, you know, in different groups, whether it's a parenting group or a class or whoever else, who has had gun violence exposure, because all of a sudden it starts coming back to like there's 20%, 30% of people. I think about my PhD cohort was 4 people. One of my classmates had been in the library for the first mass shooting at Florida State University. I think to my undergraduate class at Idaho State that I'm teaching, there are like 8 students in this class. One of them had been at Rigby Middle School when a 12-year-old girl opened fire in the hallway. She was in the classroom next to where the shooting took place. And then just of the 3 of us, I mean, I've witnessed somebody shot and killed 50 feet from me. So you see this stuff throughout life. But I think to James' point about needing a mental health resource center, put our money where our mouth is,
Yeah.
we're mixing 2 different issues. One of them, which the Violence Project book and your study of mass shootings from the offender standpoint, is that you need mental health resources for people in crisis. And that's about having systems to push somebody into the resources to prevent them from committing violence. That's completely different from having victim-centered services that are very accessible, very open, come as you need them. And those are 2 different sides of gun violence that really need entirely different systems.
Yeah, and it's one of those things of, and we need both, right? You're exactly right. We need something to address those that might be on the pathway to violence to perpetrating it. And then we also need those resources on the back end of those who've been victimized by it. But I think your point is exactly right, David. I think about work I've done in a previous life. I was a middle school special education teacher. And I think about the exposure to violence that my students had. Currently, Gillian and I are doing some projects in public schools here in Minnesota, particularly in St. Paul. Some of these young people are exposed to gun violence literally every day. They are carrying weapons because they're afraid of the violence that occurs in their community. There's interesting data, even within our own survey, about exposure and experience with, for instance, gangs and gang violence, in addition to the everyday gun violence that we're seeing. And these are conversations that we often don't really talk about. But for many young people growing up in the most disadvantaged circumstances, gun violence is truly an everyday reality for them. And we know that's having a detrimental impact on their physical health and their mental health. In addition, then, to those high-profile cases that where people who are perhaps not exposed on a day-to-day basis will then be exposed in one big event. And you add it all together and you get to some pretty striking numbers and a serious problem for this. You know, in our data, it was women, it was young people, those even just witnessing violence without a bullet ever touching them, had real responses to this, and they need those trauma-informed services just as much as the direct victims do on a day-to-day basis.
I was thinking the same thing, James. It's like thinking about our work in the St. Paul public schools and how it's kind of all connected in a way too, right? They are 2 separate things, but it's like when you have been exposed to gun violence and you're anxious and you're afraid and you're on edge You're more likely to carry a gun to protect yourself. You're more likely to quickly escalate, right? Like we see these young people then becoming involved in certain situations, or it can be those become risk factors for violence itself, right? And so it all is kind of interconnected in that way. But I think generally we need really easily accessible mental health services. I'm a huge advocate for school-based mental health because young people are the ones being most exposed. If it's school-based, you don't have to go anywhere else. You don't need a caretaker who can get you there. It's just right there. It's in the building and it's free. And unfortunately, with kind of the state of our economy right now, that's really what's getting cut in a lot of districts.
Yeah, and then for the exposure to gun violence, I recorded an episode, number 34, is with Josh Novak. He was a teacher in Chicago, and now he's a trauma-informed counselor, and specifically mass violence, which when we talk about exposure, he was going to the Highland Park 4th of July parade with his kids when there was a mass shooting there, and his specialty is being a trauma-informed counselor to treat people in mass shootings. And it's happening in his own community. So I think we also need to understand that mental health services don't mean one thing, that there's acute treatment for somebody who's in psychosis. There's acute treatment for somebody that has severe depression and is in suicidal. And then there's different degrees of counseling services that need to be catered to students in school that are struggling with all the things in school compared to students in school who just experienced a shooting. And we don't seem to have the appropriate resources lined up for any of those things.
Yeah, it's kind of a sad indictment on the state of the world in many ways. But it's also the broader question of where do we put our priorities and what matters most to us as a society. And I would like to think that if the United States is the richest country in the world, and all the measures are there for the levels of success that it has, a greater investment in the social safety net would be something we would want to do. Unfortunately, over the last few years, and I think going forward, the current environment, it seems to be a stripping away of that social safety net. And I think a lot of that might be rooted in just a fundamental misunderstanding of what all this stuff really means and where these challenges really lie from. There's this sort of perception that those who are receiving government assistance in some ways are the problem. And that isn't really the attitude that's taken in many other Western democracies around the world that have a much more, I think, humane approach to some of these challenges when we think about mental health, access to healthcare, access to education, access to housing, and all these other factors as well. To some degree, this, of course, goes beyond this particular study and this particular project that we've been looking at. But I think it's a through line throughout our research with the Violence Project ever since we started really diving deeply into this. And it's certainly a through line in the work I did prior to this as well, looking at gang violence and youth violence, which was, there are definitely these structural challenges that underpin the things that we see. And there are things that could be done on a structural level to in a policy level that could affect change here. So in that regard, it's sort of all connected. I think gun violence is like a public health spillover event. The psychological fallout, it's radiating out way beyond the actual crime scene itself. And then what our data are showing is it also lasts way longer than the news cycle. And in many cases, it's lasting years, and it might be shaping the outcomes and life chances of individuals into perpetuity.
And I think that's what policymakers are missing in a lot of these risk-benefit calculations and some of the ways that laws are being changed, is when you realize the nature of gun violence, that most of it is not premeditated. Most of it is interpersonal disputes that turn into shootings. They happen in public places. So if you have, say, a state that has really permissive concealed carry laws, what that means is that an argument in the supermarket turns into a shooting, where it would just be an argument. Now it's a shooting. What I don't think people are realizing before, what you've quantified in this study, is the pervasive impact that that's going to have on the 100 other people that are in that supermarket. That those 100 other people, 60 of them are going to have severe anxiety and mental health issues for the next year or more after this. So if you're a policymaker and you say, oh, it's an easy political win to, pass a law that repeals permitting. Well, what's the impact of that? It means that somebody who's minding their own business gets traumatized in a grocery store and there are no resources to help them. And I don't think that's the discussion that we're having at all, that guns in public places create danger for everybody in public places and create very lasting impacts for everyone else. So my last question for each of you here is, so based on, you got completely unexpected results from this survey, which I think really speaks to the power of the survey and the importance of scientific inquiry and just putting questions out there, because you don't really know what's going to happen. What would the follow-up research that you would want to propose, kind of based on what you found here?
Well, there's definitely, with every research project, there's always the, oh, why didn't we do that? Or the what ifs. So in some cases, I think some of the ways we frame some of our questions, I would love to go back and add a few more sub-questions and variables to it. I'll give an example. We asked, for instance, have you ever been physically injured on the scene of a shooting? But we didn't disaggregate within that physical injury being shot from being trampled, from having an audible injury because of the sound of the gunshot. Maybe some people interpreted that as a psychological injury and stuff like that. I would love to be able to kind of go back and, if I could wave a magic wand and do it again, really disaggregate that in more ways. But all that to be said, we also did this. We were incredibly grateful that we received funding from the state of Minnesota to do research that looked at harms related to firearms. That was kind of our mandate to do this. It was a very wide mandate. So we could effectively do anything with this funding, which is very rare. Usually you're specifically funded to do a very specific project. So we had the funding to be able to do a survey on this scale. And we definitely see it as a sort of benchmark that now we have some estimates for the first time on some of these measures. It's definitely the task of future research to stress test that, to push against it, to see whether or not there's other things that need to be learned from this. So in an ideal world, I would like to do a survey like this every year and keep seeing whether we see the numbers change. And again, drilling it down deeper into some of those definitions and some of those other things. But a survey on this scale is very expensive. It's very labor intensive. We've basically dedicated nearly 2 years of work just to get to this point. And at the moment, the state of research funding is such that I don't know whether we're going to get the state of Minnesota or the federal government or a philanthropic organization coming in and saying, these questions warrant investigation and we're willing to fund the types of research necessary to get at them. The landscape at the moment is that the funding for all scientific inquiry, but particularly for gun violence research, really seems to be drying up. And that's worrying because that's going to have a detrimental impact on knowledge. And in turn, that's going to have a detrimental impact on outcomes.
And I mean, this research needs to get done because, I mean, reading this really seems as significant as, in the research in the 60s or 70s, really realizing that secondhand smoke was harmful to other family members and children. I mean, that was something that you didn't know until it got studied. And seeing now the profound life altering consequences of even having a shooting in your community, that's the secondhand smoke of gun violence. And we don't even really have our hands around gun violence itself. These ripple effects are likely even bigger than we think. So Jill, from your perspective as a mental health practitioner, what would you like to see as a follow up to what you learned here?
Yeah, you're just listening to you, David. I was thinking about, I have 3 kids in an elementary school, and there was a shooting like 2 blocks away from their school. This was last month. Not a mass shooting. It was like domestic related, but it occurred outside. And their school had to go into lockdown for extended period of time because kind of they put the whole like 6-block radius into lockdown. They were never under threat, right? Like there was never any, so they came home and like, it hadn't really dawned on me that would have bothered them. And of the 3, they all have very different personalities, right? 2 were fine. One of them, my middle son, was incredibly upset, terrified, like just was like, I had the most horrible day, crying, processing it. For him, being in that lockdown for 3 hours, being very on edge, not knowing what was going to happen, had a significant mental health impact on him. Like, luckily his mother is a psychologist. We did a lot of processing, a lot of talking about it, right? Like, but I don't think most parents are keyed in that like we should have all been asking every kid at that school a lot of questions about how they were responding. The teachers should be like, we don't have this. I don't think people are adequately trained in how to ask these questions, how to screen for this, how to intervene, what to say, where to go, right? Like, and so I think especially adults who have contact with young people have to understand these findings and be trained in kind of how to respond and what to do with them. So to me, that's kind of the next direction I'd like to go, is like, what do we do here? How do we intervene, not just to make kids kind of okay, but resilient through this and empower them? Because ultimately the thing that's going to stop this is when we reduce gun violence, right? It's like we can respond to this mental health crisis that we have to, but the only way to actually get in front of this is to slow down the gun violence.
Yeah, and if we're not going to slow down the gun violence, I think that means that policymakers need to deal with the consequences. And that's exactly what happened with pollution and with secondhand smoke and with asbestos. So we said if we cannot address the root cause of this, we need to have really robust services and compensation and support available for making the victims whole. And that's not happening at all. And if you look at then this nationally, this is a multi-trillion-dollar expense that is being caused by shootings in public, and shootings that really, most of them were just some BS disputes where somebody opens fire and as a result, entire communities are being harmed. So I want to thank you so much for your time today. There's a link in the show notes to the paper, The Mental Health Consequences of Exposure to Mass and Non-Mass Shootings in a National Sample of U.S. Adults. James Densley's from Metro State, Jill Peterson's from Hamline University. They are the Violence Project. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having us, David.